As with Richard Powers' other novels, one of the problems or challenges that he wrestles with in the writing is not only his subject matter, but also he kind of comes back around to our understandings of the basic dimensions of craft and fiction, and in what ways does his subject matter force him to rethink plot? In what ways does that subject matter also force him to rethink character, particularly here in the Overstory? And how do we distinguish between human characters and non-human agency within this novel, as well as within kind of the larger plot of the natural world here? In terms of character, I'd like for you to kind of rethink a couple basic aspects here, right? That come out of the central challenge of the novelist of how do you take the world and render it into word? That basic kind of mimetic drive that propels a novelist into trying to tell the world within a novel. And Powers' task is heightened here in a sense because he's writing about a non-human subject in a lot of ways, right? He has characters who are traveling through the world on various journeys, but the trees themselves are literary characters in a sense, right? That they have a presence in the novel that is central to its story. So as the eco-critic Jane Bennett writes, how do you write about what she calls vibrant matter? That stuff is defined by its inherent interactions with the human world and with other agents in the non-human world, and so that's Powers' task in this novel. And so, how does it force you to rethink the idea of the literary character? And a companionable task there is, right? How does, if you rethink the literary character, as a literary device here, in what ways does that force you to rethink the human being as a presence within the world, as a presence within the story? As Neil Everdern, also an eco-critic, says, are human beings colonies or organisms or what? How does this novel force you to kind of rethink the human being as, as entity, as matter within the world? And, how does Powers' novel do that? As the novelist John Updike writes at a point, that our connection with reading a novel is so dependent upon our sense of a character's individual moral adventure that we read novels, with a sense of where does the character go? How does the character redefine self within the world? How does the character face various points of conflict and challenge and emerge from those things as a different person? That goes back to the basic challenge of human subjectivity in writing, that we gravitate towards the character as locus in fiction, right? That a good story is about a solid character and the character's, journey in the end. But what happens if you rethink that focus? Instead of focusing on the individual moral adventure, what if you refocus it on kind of larger human activities, larger human activities on the communal, social, economic, or cultural levels? How does that force you to rethink the human presence in the world? How does it force you to rethink human drives, forces, interaction, and the ways in which we shape that world? Some writers here would, push us to a sense of how do you tell the human aggregate, human beings' journey on a larger level, versus a simple sense of the human being versus nature as conflict here. In what ways do our shared activities, particularly our shared economic activities, things like farming and logging, how do they reshape the environment, but how do they also reshape us as human beings? And so how do you tell this human aggregate seems to be one of Powers' challenges in this novel, as he rethinks a conflict of the human versus the non-human world. One way that it might be helpful to think about, telling the aggregate here is to kind of go back to the late 19th, early 20th century, writers who were significantly influenced by Charles Darwin but also by their times, and kind of thinking about the ways in which larger forces have impact on human activity. And so in what ways are human beings as characters pushed about by various forces within a novel? A French writer like Émile Zola wants to think about economic activity, and how are human beings propelled by economic forces that are beyond their control. How does it impact them in larger groups, in terms of society, in terms of community, in terms of fields of work? And so you could kind of think about the idea of force here. In what ways do human beings create forces that reshape the natural, the economic, the communal world that's here? So a writer like Chicago's Theodore Dreiser, who's writing about the economic forces that define his characters in a novel like Sister Carrie, the late 19th, early 20th century. In what ways do these forces shape us, and in what ways do we shape these forces that redefine the worlds that surround us? And how is Powers' novel, akin to that, as he kind of thinks about the conflict between the human and the non-human worlds in the Overstory? This presents us with another question or problem, perhaps, right? Which is, in what ways do we think about the agency of human beings versus the agency of non-human presences within the world? If you think about a tree's impact on the world, you think about a tree's agency to change the world. How does that, force you to kind of rethink other non-human presences, agency here, right? Are we willing to admit, for instance, right, that non-human presences have a kind of impact on human beings as creative agents themselves? In what ways do they exert force on human behaviors, or how does that force us to rethink a sense of human will or human ends from that? And does that also kind of force us to rethink a sense of human beings' own understanding of having an exceptional consciousness within the world? So, for instance, in terms of something that we consider, living, right? In what ways do viruses impact us here, right? In what ways do they exist as creative agents in the world, that have a sense of purpose, a sense of, a force, a sense of agency, as they redefine not only this wider sense of the world, but in what ways do we adapt to them, and as we move through the world, and how does their sense of survival indicate a sense of purpose and a sense of want? Much like a human character in a novel, is defined by its wants. In what ways do we understand the virus's own sense of want? A non-living thing here might be how to rethink, oil here as, a non-human agent. In what ways do human beings adapt the world to oil's sense of purpose in a way? Amitav Ghosh thinks about this in The Great Derangement. In what ways has oil redefined human agency? In what ways has or our lack of agency, perhaps, as you think about climate change? In what ways does oil exert a force on human behavior that undercuts any kind of sense of human will here? You can also think about another impulse here is artificial intelligence. In what ways will it continue to act as an agent on human behavior? In what ways do we adapt ourselves to AI as it continues to develop? And how does it cause us to rethink our own sense of an exceptional consciousness as artificial intelligence itself develops and continues to build force on the ways in which human beings navigate the world? I think this is a central question to Powers' novel. He admits this in some interviews, right? The sense of that as he's writing this novel, he came back to a sense of the human being versus nature as a central conflict. In what ways do we come back to a sense of conflict between the human and non-human worlds as we rethink climate change. So how does this leave us with trees as characters here? In what ways does the novel force us into a sense of deeper ecology, to rethink, human impact upon the environment, and to rethink the environment's impact upon us? We could just make this kind of a simplified anthropomorphism in a way, right, where we make trees just like human beings and give them feelings and such. But how does Power's novel try to avoid that? In what ways does it attempt to kind of rethink the tree's agency, forests' agency in the world, their purposes, their sense of force on the larger world's behavior, and their sense of force on human behavior? In the end, it's a question that Powers is kind of engaged with from the very beginning, right? As the trees speak in that opening, if your mind were only a slightly greener thing, we'd drown you in meaning. What is the sense of the tree's memory? What do the trees, and how do the trees communicate? How do they exert force on the human imagination? And one question I think that comes to the fore as Powers' novels develop here is the question of, does a more complex sense of humanity emerge for you as a reader? In what ways does that human versus non-human conflict or interaction, in what ways does a more complex sense of your own self, as a human being, as part of this world that includes all these non-human entities, how does it complicate your sense of presence there as well? Look forward to your responses as we continue our reading of the novel. Thanks.